Rebecca, we're not, to your point, just protecting this because it's the right thing to do. We're doing it because we're being held to account by regulators and audits and the requirements in different industries to what the legal situation is in those jurisdictions. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't just pertain to the data that you have control over in your own organization. You also have to be thinking about supply chains, what your suppliers are doing, what you're doing out towards your customers. And so let's try to address this data resiliency issue, not just for the data that you think you have control over, but the data that you're actually responsible for.
And that's a great point, because responsibility follows data. It's, if you have collected the data, then you're taking responsibility for what happens to that data while it is being processed by you, stored by you, or when someone else has been contracted to perform those activities on your behalf. So you have to ensure that your third parties, that your contracted entities are doing what you've promised to do, first of all. A lot of times organizations don't realize that. So if they're making promises, for instance, that you're encrypting all of your data in storage, you need to make sure that if you've contracted a third party to store your data for you and they're putting it into the containers, are they encrypting that data there? If they aren't, then they are going to be violating your promise, which will, and probably, and has, come back and result in a fine or a penalty against your organization. So you have to ensure your third parties in that way are meeting their requirements, but then you also have supply chain vulnerabilities you need to address as well that are coming in through firmware in the different types of products that are being used, not only in your organization, but by your third parties, by your contracted entities. And another thing that I'm seeing a lot of also is just being able to identify when a breach has occurred, because you don't know where that personal data is. And if you have third parties, do they know how to quickly tell you not only where that data is at so you can get it, but you have to do an accounting of disclosures for many different legal requirements, HIPAA, GDPR, the states, many states now have their own state laws about that. But you have to be able to say who has been accessing this data. And in order to do that, you have to log the access to that data, the account that accessed it, the date, time, what happened when they accessed it, if they read it, if they changed it, and so on. So there's a lot of specific requirements for these types of issues that you must plan with any third party that you're contracting. And not only those you're contracting to perform services, but those from whom you're purchasing these different types of products. And this would include your Internet of Things products and other types of products that are housing or collecting or transmitting data that end up in containers, but they might still be storing that same data out in the cloud as well. So it is a complex issue, but we can make it simpler when we sit down and start thinking about things, in a very organized manner.
All right, Safi, of course, when you're dealing with a rich pool of technologies to support your services and your data and apps, you are looking at a sort of supply chain of IT that you need to be responsible for in terms of patch management and configuration management and being on top of the right versions that work together and not against each other and so on. Is there something about containers that makes this idea of patch management and configuration management more complex? I'm guessing that more people have the ability to spin up a VM or use a container, and so there might be an issue of sprawl, and the types of people that are able to do these things might not be your security-minded folks. So how complex and difficult is it to keep the type of containers that are being used up to date and as safe as possible?
Yeah, it is a very challenging problem. I think one of the first times I dealt with this, I was supporting NASA on a few cloud-based initiatives. And so we had successfully migrated, 300 some apps into AWS commercial. And there were a few customers who wanted to containerize while moving into the cloud. They wanted to modernize their application, which made sense. The challenge there was we were providing like a shared security service. And so the majority of our teams were optimized the majority of our operations were able to be optimized because we were using one tool, because we didn't have any containers, right? So as you start to think about growth, implementing container technology, you want to make sure you have the tools to, maintain that same level of security that you're expecting throughout the rest of your ecosystem. But again, making sure you have the people who are skilled at managing and running those tools, because, the newer the tool, the less likely is someone is going to be an expert in it, right? And that expert already happens to live in your organization. So you definitely want to make sure that you have the right level of support with vendors, understanding, of course, then, if a vendor now has access to your production environment, you obviously want to go through the proper third-party risk management vetting process, right, that your organization should have. But if you're able to overcome those challenges, right, you have the resources, you have the tools. The next step is how can we make sure to really get to the meat of your question, how can we make sure we're controlling the images that are being used or deployed on these containers? And so one good way that I've seen it done is you essentially have AMIs or builds, right, cloud instances that you have pre-provisioned for use, and it has a hardened baseline on it, right? So that hardened baseline could include an agent for whichever type of vulnerability scanning or vulnerability management you'll be using to push out any patches, but certainly to have a good understanding of what is resident on that box. So as you provide access to an admin or a developer to build on top of that image, you want to make sure two things are turned on. Definitely, you want to make sure there's some form of auditing, right? You understand what is happening on that box, even though you no longer have access to it, meaning you've given it to someone else to provision. But you want to not only have audit logs being pulled from that box, but you want to make sure those audit logs are centralized and are in a location where people can't negatively, or can't affect them in a way where if we did need to conduct some type of forensic investigation, we wouldn't have adequate logs. And the other thing is, in addition to just logging, we don't want to just pull logs for the sake of pulling logs. I've seen logs be a great source of information for many different parts of an organization. Certainly from the security portion, we can have those logs ingested into our organization SOC, right? So now we have a centralized location, the logs are being managed, there's alerts being triggered if there is, a indication of compromise across the ecosystem, right? So we really want to make sure we're not just giving people access to this technology and then kind of walking backwards out of the room. It's still, as security professionals, it's still our responsibility to make sure we know, how those assets that are being deployed in our environments are either positively or negatively impacting our organization's risk posture.
Right. Those are some great best practices. And I want to go to you, Rebecca, before our time's up in this panel discussion about some best practices at perhaps a higher level of governance. It seems to me that we've been talking about many different players, many different technologies, a great deal of complexity. And one of the ways we've always solved those sorts of complex issues is to have a form of governance, even enterprise architecture best practices to help manage that. So what should people be thinking about in terms of best practices at the governance level to manage these issues around data protection in a distributed era like we're in now?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because oftentimes when new technology is moved to, the policies and procedures aren't updated to reflect that. Now, certainly policies should be as technology agnostic as possible. However, when the characteristics of the technologies are changing so drastically, then you must go in and update your policies for the associated activities for storing data in a completely different type of area, and for accessing data and for protecting data. So the first thing with governance is make sure that you update your policies and then the supporting procedures that help the different business units to reach compliance with those policies. After you've done that, then you're ready to then go out and provide training for those folks who have responsibilities for complying with those policies, right? Those policies aren't going to help you if you've not communicated them, and asking people to just read them is not helping them to understand them. So provide training, provide ongoing awareness communications, and then after they've had time to understand that, after everything's been implemented, go out and do a risk assessment that includes the scope of the containers, and make sure that you test for those things that we've been talking about. If you use different types of standards, I'm kind of a huge fan of the NIST standards. I've done work for NIST since 2009, so that could have something to do with it. But within NIST SP 853 Rev 5, there are several different controls within that apply to containers, not only explicitly, but also implicitly with regard to configuration, change control, and so on. So make sure that when you're doing your risk assessments, you are including within the scope these containers. Too many organizations leave them out because they're like, oh, that's a third party. That's not in the scope of our applicability. Well, it is, because that's your data. You're responsible for it. You need to know that all of those risks that we've been talking about so far have been mitigated to an acceptable level of risk. So that in kind of a thumbnail set of words is what I think I'd start out with governance.
Well, great. Thank you very much for that. We're about out of time for our discussion and our panel, but it seems to me that even though the complexity is there, we have the means to manage this data across its ecosystem distribution, across its life cycle, and even in very high velocity real-time environments. And so the good news is that we can start to use data more strategically in more places safely.